When I was in junior high school, I went through this phase where I got into collecting comic books. And I say collecting because as I got introduced to comics, it wasn't really about who are the characters who I really wanted to read stories about, but more like these could be very valuable and you should hold on to them because one day, decades from now, these comic books might be collector's items and you should save them. So I have this stash of comic books that all are in these protective plastic mylar sleeves that I would rarely read. I might look through once and then put away with the thought, one day this will be valuable. I mean, that's the logic of collecting items like that, is that there's only so many copies of Batman 500 or Superman #1 or Detective Comics or whatever printed, and that if you've got one, it becomes rarer as time goes on. And so there has more and more value because of its scarcity, because I've got it and you don't. And as long as I've kept mine sealed up nice and tightly in its little plastic sleeve, nobody's fingerprints or Cheeto dust or dirt or damage or water will get on it, and it will become a more valuable commodity. This was how young entrepreneur teenage me thought of comic books. That they might have future cash value if they were scarce and if they hadn't been, tainted by being touched or in the presence of too many contaminating factors. And I'm grateful and maybe a little bit proud to say at some point I grew out of that thinking. Not because I have made a fortune in comics and have decided to part with it. I've still got boxes of old comic books somewhere, but they're ones that I let my kids page through and read, and we can take a look at them and read the stories, because something has changed for me about how I think about what has value, and something has changed for me about my fear of letting things get contaminated or touched or tainted by being around other people. And I don't mean to say that I let my kids hold fragile, breakable family heirlooms or the china plates or fragile glassware or things like that. But I do mean to say I've changed the way I think about what's valuable and what you do with valuable things, and whether it really is about something being scarce that only a few get to have. And honestly, it's Jesus who's making this difference. This coming Sunday, we're going to hear this passage that comes out of Matthew's gospel. It's a couple little scenes all strung together, and it turns out they all have something in common. The story begins in Matthew chapter 9. It goes like this. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at a tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners." While he was standing saying these things, suddenly a leader of the synagogue came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples. Suddenly, a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. For she said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be made well." Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter. Your faith has made you well." And instantly, the woman was made well. When Jesus came to the leader's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl got up. And the report of this spread throughout that district. There are these surprising interactions Jesus has with Matthew, with this woman who's had hemorrhages, who's been bleeding for 12 years, and with the dead girl, the daughter who's 12 years old herself. And there are reasons that respectable religious people might have told Jesus he has to stay off limits from all three of them. You don't hang out with one of them dirty, bad tax collectors. They're sellouts to the empire, right? They have thrown in their lot with the empire that's oppressing and harassing them and are getting rich off their fellow neighbors. And Jesus is clearly comfortable being at a dinner party with not just the tax collectors, but the other notorious, those people, the sinners. And the woman who's been bleeding for 12 years, she's, at least by the official religious rules, ceremonially unclean. There are all sorts of real strict rules within ancient Judaism's Torah to protect from infection and disease and contamination, and that becomes this real strict code of people who have medical issues, in particular related to blood. Touch other people, that makes them unclean. And you also don't lay hands on dead bodies, because that also spreads contamination and you become unclean. There are all sorts of reasons that Jesus should stay sealed up like in a Mylar plastic bag, like a comic book that somebody thinks will lose value if it touches something else. There are all sorts of reasons why people seem to think Jesus shouldn't be hanging around any of those situations, any of those people, and that by associating with those tax collectors and sinners, he's endorsing their wickedness, and he's not acknowledging that they are shameful and bad and terrible people, that Jesus accepts them by sharing table fellowship with them. And this is the thing. It seems the assumption of all the respectable religious people in the story is that Jesus, if he really does embody God's power and God's presence, if he really is in touch with God, you can't let God be contaminated. You can't let God be tainted by the wickedness or filth or rottenness or sin of the world. You have to keep God sealed up, because there's only so much of God's power to go around. There is this underlying assumption of scarcity. There's only so much of God's goodness or power to go around, so you don't let the riffraff have it. You don't let those sinful people, you don't let the people who are ceremonially unclean have that will taint, the purity of God's goodness or whatever it is that Jesus brings. It's real easy to get in that mindset, isn't it? It's real easy to think that God's power in Jesus is limited and a scarce resource, and therefore you don't want to let just anybody have it, especially people who don't live up to our moral standards and aren't, like us. And in that regard, this scene out of Matthew 9, it feels like it could have been told yesterday. This is so often still the difficult place that respectable religious people find themselves in. It's so often the role that Christians have taken on, that Jesus can't be associated with the people that we put on our list as unacceptable, unworthy, unlovable. We can't let Jesus be seen to be associating or loving or sitting at table with them. That makes it sound like he's accepting them. That makes it sound like he doesn't have a problem with them. It makes it sound like Jesus is willing to risk getting contaminated by whatever uncleanness is out there. And that's just it. Jesus isn't hung up on all this business of being contaminated or tainted. Jesus isn't interested in staying sealed up in a little Mylar plastic bag to avoid being touched by the wrong hands. Jesus deliberately puts himself in circumstances where his presence can restore people, to physical health, if this is the woman who had been bleeding or the girl who had died, but also to be restored back to relationship and to community with everybody else. If, after all, if you are ceremonially unclean by disease or a flow of blood or something like that, you're cut off from relationship with other people. And the tax collectors and the notorious sinners that everybody else is looking down on are cut off from everybody else who just looks down on them and turns their nose at them. And Jesus restores them back to relationship as well, treating them as though they are beloved, because they are, even if the respectable religious people don't see it, don't understand it. I want to suggest our calling as the followers of Jesus is to get beyond the mindset that we have to seal Jesus up, or the power of God that he brings, and keep it from being contaminated or touched or tainted by outside forces, by sin or sickness or whatever else we think might be out there, and instead to see the way Jesus just goes right into the midst of any kind of situation. The people who are treated as social pariahs and outcasts, the people who've been deemed sellouts, who have no possibility of changing their lives or starting over again, and that Jesus doesn't hold out any strings. Jesus doesn't go over to the dinner party at the sinners and tax collectors' house just sort of throwing stones at them or telling them, you're all going to burn because you're not good enough. Jesus just has dinner with them and treats them as though they are beloved, gives them dignity and worth regardless of what anybody else sees about them or thinks about them. He doesn't demand that they have to go through some kind of ritual or formal process to show how sorry they are or how much moral progress they've made. Jesus, in fact, just restores them to life, like he restores the woman who's been hemorrhaging and the synagogue leader's daughter as well. All of them are brought more fully to life in every direction. That's why this whole year our focus has been on how God's love leads us in every direction, and how Jesus' work among us isn't about helping us become more morally adept rule followers, but to be people who are brought more fully to life for all the places we've been dead, and that we become people who can spread God's love in all directions and let that bring other people more fully to life. I can't help but think, hearing this story, of a line of the late Robert Farrar Capon, theologian and Episcopal writer from an earlier generation, who said Jesus didn't come to teach the teachable or to reform the reformable. He came to raise the dead. That might be literally to raise this synagogue leader's daughter, or to restore the woman who's at least pretty sick, but also to restore people to life who've been cut off because everybody else has written them off as too far gone, too sinful, too tainted, and that Jesus, or whoever wields the presence of God, has to be contained and separate from them. This Sunday, the conversation we're going to have is how to let Jesus out of that bag, or maybe to discover, for all of our attempts to try and seal him off and keep him pure and holy and untouched by the worldliness around us, Jesus has never consented to stay inside a plastic protective bag, but Jesus has insisted on being present anywhere and everywhere in the world. That's the news we're sent to bring to somebody else, especially people who've heard too many times before they're unworthy, unacceptable, or that their presence is not wanted. Join us this Sunday for that conversation. See you then.